Okay, welcome everybody. And so today, this is the third kind of webinar-ish presentation that Nevin and I have done about this Kids These Days project. And this was something that really came about quite organically, that we um, we had talked about writing a youth mental health book together and going away from the outdoor therapies. And then we were all pretty, in some ways, a little burnt out, a little tired, and we went, let's just pause for a second on this idea. And then Nevin did this thing where he just started interviewing the the experts that we knew. And what was fascinating is so many of them, whether they were an environmental toxin researcher, uh, indigenous elder, um, uh, people that have written about cell phones and the impact on youth mental health, they all kept talking about outdoor therapies. And so it was really, we were like, okay, now we're jumping in and going to talk about youth mental health. And we used the pun of kids these days because many of us know that a lot of times we're walking around saying these youth are this is the least resilient they've ever been, or they're the laziest and the dumbest that things have ever been. And the amazing thing is that people have been saying this for thousands of years about youth. And what Nevin and I started to notice was this idea of kind of whinging about the youth of the day when we're also more medicalized than ever kind of can have really big impacts today we're going to talk about why we took sort of a zoomed out approach to youth mental health. And so yeah, Nevin, I will pass over to you to kick us off as well.
Thanks, Will. Well, as Will said, I started talking to some colleagues. I think when we do work as academics, we are encouraged to quote unquote stay in our lanes. We're asked to stay focused on your research agenda, build it from the foundation up, and work at it theoretically and conceptually. And oftentimes we find ourselves looking at the margins of our research and going, yeah, but there's also this other thing going on. If we all approach our work with at least the slightest inclination or belief that there's an ecological perspective on the work that we do, you open your lenses up really quickly. And so this collection of wonderful people here on this slide are people that I've worked with in the past, people that are somewhat legendary in their own lanes, if you want to call them as having lanes. Um, I started with people that I've worked with the most closely. So people like Dr. Michael Unger, who I've had a long-term sort of off and on. We never have really worked together that much, but we've been in communication for a long time. Dr. Martin Brokenleg, whose work influenced me as a youth worker quite early, long time ago. Through this list, these folks came to the table, shared knowledge, and put forth a lot of ideas as to what might be going on with kids these days. And again, as Will said, we play with that a little bit tongue in cheek, but we are actually concerned about young people these days, adolescents, children, adolescents, and our young adult population, which many of us work with. I think there is a number of really common themes that came out from all of these individuals around what they think is going on. But then we also heard their expertise within their lanes. So whether that's early childhood development and the role of outdoor risky play from Dr. Ellen Beat Sandcedar from Norway, the effects of relationships and attachment from Dr. Sue Johnson. Um, it's broad in its scope, and we heard so many messages, and we realized that this has to be a bigger story, and it has to be written in a way that allows for us to say, there's a lot going on here. We're not 100% sure, but our experts say this. And then we're not talking about it as much today, but behind all of these experts is also some grave concerns about the fact that a lot of their research doesn't necessarily get listened to or acted upon. And that's where the stories of government, regulatory agencies, corporations, capitalism. Like these stories all have these backstories that are quite tragic and unnerving as a listener to hear their stories. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we can make change, and the focus of our book is for adults who work with children, have influence over children and youth or young adults. That there's lots we can do, and so we're trying to tell the story, but be hopeful and productive at the same time.
And I think one thing to add, that when we actually pumped out much of the words of the book quite quickly, we became really passionate about these different areas. And then when we went to publishers, many publishers said, At youth mental health, it's boring, it's overcrowded, there's too many parenting books, there's too many ideas, you won't. And then people started reading what we were looking at, and they kind of went, oh yeah, this is really cool that we have all these different really great voices, and you meet them as people and kind of see where these ideas come from. And like Dr. Sue Johnson on the bottom left there, and unfortunately it is quite sad, she passed away this year, but Sue just talked about being raised in a British pub and how she watched her dad, her father, connect with people who might have been a widow, who had really a tough go at life. And she goes, I learned more about psychotherapy from watching my dad in this pub than anything I learned in a textbook. And Sue Johnson is really someone that was really important in the 90s and early 2000s, of getting psychology to remember that emotions are really important. And it's not just cognitions and behavior, that we need to think about the emotional well-being of people and how we feel our feelings. So it's just such a wonderful list of people. And it's been just really one of the coolest projects I've been a part of. But at the same time, one thing really interesting that happened is, while we were doing this, many books came out that were really quite narrow in their focus. So, Nevin, I'll pass back to you about this kind of recent phenomenon in the books that are coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. So uh, many of you might already be aware of Leonora Skenazy's book in the bottom left there, Free Range Kids. I can't even remember its release date. It's been out maybe for a decade now, but um, in it, the focus of youth problems, or kids these days problems at the time, was that they weren't allowed to have enough unstructured, unsupervised play or risk activities in their lives. And it was a significant book in that it had impact. If we go back another decade, we had Richard Louve's Last Child in the Woods, which basically said, kids these days, there's problems. It's because they don't play outdoors and they don't have enough connection with nature. And then other books that have come along, Abigail Schreier's Bad Therapy book there in the top right, blaming it on therapy, therapeutic thinking, therapeutic ideas, too much talk about mental health, too much influence of mental health and safety in the school systems, and just putting the narrow focus on that. We recognize that publishers like books that are narrow and to the point and singular in their topics. They tend less often to publish books that are holistic in their perspective, or take a broad spectrum approach. The bottom right, Bruce Perry's book with Oprah Winfrey, Trauma. It's trauma, trauma, trauma. We have too much trauma, 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 trauma. And I've worked with clients that have had to step away from trauma therapists because they have been stuck in their trauma, talking about their trauma and reliving their trauma over and over again, and not working towards positive, healthy change in their lives. And then the top right is obviously the one getting a lot of attention right now, Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, a book that basically is claiming that the cell phones and a bunch of their features, like front-facing cameras and like buttons and selfies and the infinite scroll, are the cause of the mental health crisis today. And we know now, and I too have a teenage daughter in school who's got a cell phone ban in the classroom. It's not ever the case that there's one problem. And so Will and I have addressed this. We've looked at an idea or a term from the 1970s. Riddle and Weber talked about this in 1973. They came out with this term, wicked problems. Wicked problems have been used as a foundational sort of a theoretical lens to look at problems across all sorts of industries and areas of research. It's been used in social services. It actually came out of design. It came out of the world of design. So if you think of a puzzle, you've got a box, it says 100 pieces, it says 1,000 pieces. If all the pieces are there, you have to figure out how the puzzle goes together. Well, wicked problems are the opposite of puzzles. There is no clear logical answer to it. There may be 1,000 pieces, but they're not all going to fit together perfectly to create this one finished product. And so there's some key pieces. There's no definitive formula. It's actually really hard to define. We have a sense as parents, as therapists, as academics, as researchers, that there is something going on. Youth today are struggling. Not all of them, but overall, there is a sense that they're struggling. The statistics definitely support that, and we've made an argument for that. We won't know the answer, even if we think we get to it, even though we're pointing in 10 or 11 different directions across our chapters and from our experts' voices and from our own opinions. We don't know, but we're going to put forward a lot of possible solutions based on possible problems. They're not right or wrong, good or bad, right? They're just potential solutions to the problem. And that every time we try to intervene, there's going to be something that comes from it. This cell phone ban just happened. It basically happened this school year. The book Anxious Generation came out, and the influence of the marketing campaign with Jonathan Haidt's publisher, it's pushed senators and governors and schools into making decisions to ban cell phones. That is going to have consequences. Any intervention will lead to some subsequent response. There will be something that comes of that. It may be good, maybe bad, but we don't know what it is. But it's probably going to be unexpected. All these problems are unique. I'm just trying to work through these bullet points. Every wicked problem can be considered a symptom of another problem, oftentimes, and Will and I write about this in the book. I'm a little bit older than Will. I was a bit of an idiot in the classroom. When I got in trouble, I got something called the strap. Will's experience and his contemporaries have been more medicated. We didn't have medication. We weren't medicated. I probably would have been a medicated student in my school days, but instead they just tried to scare us straight. There is a reason that they moved away from corporal punishment, which looks like abuse and is abuse in many forms, to a medicalization and diagnostic approach, which will have also consequences. So it's been substituted. We, in the book, we call that potentially a regrettable substitution, and that came from one of our experts' mouths. We don't have all the answers. Wicked problems can be explained in numerous ways. We all have no space or right to be wrong. Be wrong. Our actions have consequences. Be wrong. So what we're putting forward is our exploration with all of these expert voices, trying to identify what types of things adults might be able to do to protect kids these days. And we're recognizing and accepting that it's a wicked problem. We don't have to resolve the problem because we wouldn't know what the right answer is. And that's part of our criticism of books like this that have pinned it down and tried to say, cell phones are the problem. Therapy is the problem. Outdoor play, lack of outdoor play is the problem. Trauma is the problem. We're saying yes and, yes and, yes and, yes and. And just so folks know, all of these authors have received considerable critique of their work for being too narrow in scope because they didn't recognize it or write it in a way that shows that it's multifaceted, multivariable, and it's a wicked problem.
Yeah. And I think in this second bullet point, the search for a solution never stops. I mean, it was only 1977 that the first meta-analysis was ever conducted that said psychotherapy works, and psychotherapy works really, really well. And we had about 60 different empirically supported psychotherapy treatments. 50 years later, we have over 1,000. and we haven't gotten 1%, one percentage better at doing. So we keep reinventing the same kind of solution over and over, which is banning phones. Another really good example of wicked problems, especially in the Australian context, is many schools are trying to become so focused on STEM education, and this is probably the same across the whole Western world, which is science, technology, mathematics, right? Um, and what we're seeing is at the macro level, literacy rates are declining, mathematic abilities at year 12 graduates is declining, while at the same time, we've removed more risky play, more free time away from adults to play and explore. And so you would think that if we're focusing on science and technology and maths way more often, we should see the increase. But maybe by removing the risky play, we're subsequently it's that regrettable substitution where we might be harming the emotional well-being of the youth at the same time. So I really thought when Nevin introduced this wicked problems idea, it really made us just think, oh, we've got the zoomed out version of where some of these authors are getting critiqued based on these ideas. And
Mhm.
the wicked problems, it's not something not known by the major agencies. It's something that it's important that it's used to help us understand really big databases, right? Where a big um, research database of outcomes with a ton of variables, eventually you're going to find something that looks like causation just because that's how numbers work. But if we keep this idea that there are problems that can be difficult or impossible to solve because of changing requirements, and that it's hard to recognize all the different factors influencing anything. And I think the only thing Nevin and I've been trying to do is take this concept and apply it in the youth mental health arena, where we keep kind of sort of hearing really narrow ideas of, oh, if we just throw the phones away, everyone will be a resilient teenager all of a sudden. Or if we stop the overprotection, or if we over medicate or stop medicating, or everybody gets therapy or no one gets therapy. So I think sometimes and this is kind of the deeper dive that we've taken, is sometimes the simplistic views actually lead us all to becoming more divisive, where probably the overarching concept that of what's going on is a huge lack of social connection from adults and youth, an adult oriented social connection for young people, which Dr. Gordon Neufeld talked a lot about with us as well, and has an amazing book, Hold On to Your Kids, which is very much worth the read, and has made a productive career in staying focused and vigilant on teaching people that yes, young people need to go play and have fun and be away from adults, but still that secure attachment is so important with for emotional well-being.
Mhm.
Do you want
I
to add
think
to that?
maybe, well, the only thing I would add to that is that, and we've written about this in the book, is that as many, wicked problems are, people are seeking resolution to them, they're looking for causation, or they're looking for solutions. And one of the things we found is that a lot of the solutions are sought in the wrong places. So the end goal would be, let's resolve it with technology, or let's resolve it through medicine, or let's resolve it through. So we know that things like lifestyle diseases, sedentary lifestyle diseases, whether it's obesity, whether it's diabetes, are increasing rates of cancer. We know that the rates of autism has gone up significantly over the years. The majority of research, and what we heard from some researchers, is that up to 90 to 95% of funding that is raised or put towards finding the solution or finding the answer is directed towards genetic research, which means we're trying to find the problem in the person. And regardless of whether we're talking about the quality of the food that one eats or the type of instruction one gets in a classroom as a child, we're tending to look to the individual for the solution to fix the problem. And our lens is also turned outwards, and we're looking at things that could be contributing to problems before they become something that needs this massive intervention. And interventions is one of our three focus areas that Will is going to talk about in a upcoming slide, I believe.
Hopefully right now. Yeah, so we came up with, like any decent social scientists idea, we have a good alliteration here of interference, intervention, and ideology. And so some of the ideas of interference definitely stems from the medical model. We think about digital interference, which goes back to Jonathan Haidt's central argument. And we interviewed someone, Dr. Mary Swingle, who has a very different take from Jonathan Haidt about the phones, that there's the possibility of a digital integration as opposed to just an interference, that we can form a healthy relationship with our technology. We know that houses are getting bigger. More and more people don't know the name of their next door neighbor, and so we're becoming more socially isolated. And that outdoor play was another really big one, that we should find kind of ways to go back to a play-based childhood, which again, that links Lenore Skenazy and Jonathan Haidt's argument right back. The one I grow probably most passionate about is the intervention side, which is sometimes and I'll talk more about this on the next slide. Sometimes when a social science idea becomes mainstream, it somehow morphs into that it's a natural law. And so one thing that we know about most the medications that are given to youth, most of them didn't come out of just laboratory research to solve this problem. We usually had the medication and then created the diagnosis. And so we've got this ad hoc intervention. And so things that we know from the literature that we've been reading is it's typically the youngest person in the classroom that's most likely to be diagnosed with an ADHD diagnosis. And so that was really interesting to us, where these the over intervening can be totally culturally bound to how we and the systems that we have. Psychotherapy, what I think that's how Nevin and I formed a relationship, nerding out about psychotherapy. I mean, the fact that we have so many of them and somehow keep looking in the box to find out of the box solutions is remarkable. The killer D's, this is diagnosis, deficiencies, disabilities, deficits. We tend to catalog our interventions based on how we can categorize what's wrong with most of us. And then one of the really interesting ones, and we learned this from one of the editors of the New York Times. She wrote this amazing article about the decade of the parenting manual, that even when Lenore Skenazy's book, Free Range Kids, came about after everybody in New York City saw her 9-year-old child on the subway and thought, oh my gosh, this is horrible, this is neglectful. Well, at the similar time, Tiger Mom, Amy Chua's book, came out. So the message to parents was do more or do less. And many people can't navigate all the different pieces of advice. And so it's kind of it's an ongoing overload of information. And then ideology, which is such a loaded political term nowadays with our identity politics and all that sort of stuff. One of the things that we started talking about was the safety trap, which is the overprotection. And for instance, things like, I see this from my own childhood, where I grew up in a neighborhood that loved Halloween. And so you would see hundreds of kids in the street trick-or-treating. And out of the I guess the fear for the need of safety, many folks in America are just meeting in parking lots, usually a church parking lot, and doing trick or trunking, so you don't have to knock on a stranger's door. And that leads to a huge extinction of experience. And I think we're seeing the effect of this with young people getting their driver's license years later than when would be conventional, traditional, whatever that means. And so those were kind of the three ways we broke up some of our concepts. Nevin, anything you want to add to that?
No, just that I think if people read the smaller text around the alliteration, um, they'll have their own sort of version of what that might look like and what it might be, and just to know that to be able to squish any one of these ideas we're sharing into a chapter has been a really difficult process because each one of them already has books written on them. So we're doing our best to try to get to the point, but recognize that we're taking a risk of missing things and maybe overshooting on our topics, or underperforming in terms of the content. So it's been a really challenging writing process, and I think we need to have it wrapped up by October. Will?
I think November 15th we
There we
have,
go.
but
15th.
yeah, yeah. But I kind of think one of the big um, areas where a lot of this comes from, and not to go opposite to our conversation about wicked problems, is the when the ideas that come from social science, the social sciences, which are inherently philosophical, enter into the medicalization of lived experience, we can see a slippery slope to harm. We interviewed Dr. Simon Davidson, who is a psychiatrist. He was born in South Africa, and he talked about from the age of 5, just seeing the segregation and apartheid and thinking, I I just can't believe this exists. Eventually finished his medical degree in Canada and was a chief psychiatrist in Ottawa. Is that right,
Ottawa,
Nevin?
Ottawa
Yeah,
Children's Hospital.
yeah. And one of the things he talked about was young people, when therapy speak and pop psychology language entered into probably social media, he was starting to have clients that would come to him to tell him what their diagnosis was. So he told the story of a young woman coming in and saying, I'm definitely not bipolar because my dad's bipolar and I hate my dad for being bipolar, but I'm borderline. And he said, whoa, 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 slow down a second. And what was interesting is there's probably a lot of people that would go, well, if that's the right diagnosis, provide the right diagnosis. But these are all kind of social constructions that then become absolutes. And even this year, just a few months ago, um, doctors all across the United Kingdom are calling for, let's just stop altogether diagnosing youth with personality disorders at all, because of the extreme discrimination that comes and stigma when they start entering into help seeking relationships, where there's tons of research about discrimination in emergency rooms just for having that diagnosis as well. Another phenomenon that we looked at, and Dr. Gordon Neufeld put us on to this. Again, that's the author of Hold On to Your Kids. He said when Nevin was interviewing him that we don't need to teach Zen to 5-year-olds, which this is just an example of one of these ideas where a medicalized idea enters into the mainstream. And by no means are either of us anti-medicine. It's more the philosophical viewpoint of the intervention. Um, and what Dr. Neufeld said was that children need emotional playgrounds to feel their feelings, to feel them out. And when we have big feelings, Maggie Dent is also just such a guru at talking about this, that when we have big feelings, we need adults that are regulated to allow the child to experience that feeling. And so we found a few of these really big and recent studies. I mean, all of these studies are from the last 2 years, where, for instance, in the first one, there was a Wise Teens program initiative. They gave 563 students a dialectical behavioral therapy skills training intervention. 508 other students just went to school. So these are universal programs in the schools. And what they found is that the WISE program is not recommended. So just intervening for the sake of intervening and not really tailoring the intervention becomes quite problematic. Here's a much bigger study, My Resilience in Adolescence. This was called MyAD, or Myriad, I think. And so you have over 4,000 receiving a school-based mindfulness training, 4,000 just going to schools. And we still need to ask what works for whom and how. So in many ways, the intervening doesn't lead to better outcomes. And then the last one, 19 schools, thousands of youth received a CBT informed program, 18 different schools with thousands of youth just went to school as usual. And they found, based on all the recent findings, that there's just limited efficacy for this. And with everything that we're talking about this book, we've tried our best to keep all the receipts for the references that we're using, so that it's not about listening to our opinion on it, but you can just go find the literature and do that reading yourself. And we've really tried to also pick stuff that is open access, that you can go to the link and at a minimum read the abstract, but also make up your mind based on the methods that these researchers have used. So we're seeing more ideas with good intentions that seem to also not be working from the start. And so that was something we were worried about in how we approached a lot of this. So just an example of something that becomes a universal program, and that's what these school-based interventions are called. And so, but I think everyone here that's either studying one of the helping professions, passionate about parenting, or someone who's working in the human services knows that even the concept of universal is kind of ridiculous. That it's shockingly obvious that if we homogenize everyone to fit into one box, it's not really going to go that well. I could see your gears turning, Nevin. What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, I just think from a really, really practical, pragmatic perspective, there's another little alliteration there. Um, I think if you think of school teachers and you think of the system in which they're working in and the difficulties which they face on a daily basis, if we do have all of these statistics showing increases in mental health disorders and behavioral problems and potentially autism and other forms of, diverse abilities that teachers then have to deal with in the classroom, an intervention that would be strategic to help kids deal with their own emotions, like social emotional learning programs, it sounds right. It sounds helpful. And as Gordon Neufeld had said, it's probably the worst thing we've ever done. Because as a parenting guru based on attachment theories, his understanding is quite simple. And we can translate that to a very simple example. If a young person is incapable of regulating their own emotions, the older, wiser one, the adult in the room, has to be able to care for the individual so that they know that they're safe and they can experience those big emotions in that emotional playground that he talks about, and then also work through them. That's co-regulation. What we're doing with these universal programs is essentially telling the child, telling the youth, go deal with your stuff, you deal with your emotions, and when you're regulated, come back and we'll talk about it or deal with it. And I think those two things are very, very different approaches. And I think what we've come to discover through the experts' voices and from the literature that we've read is that the research is now showing that, yes, these programs are maybe not that good of an idea. And I know, Will, you were cautious in the way you presented these studies, but there was indications in their statistics as well that some of these programs are actually leading to no change and deterioration in scores, potentially increasing the
Yeah.
likelihood of that which they're trying to prevent, right?
Mm. Yeah, and I think one of the things that we preface this early on in the book, that we aren't anti any of these ideas. And if it works for anyone, fantastic. Like, we're not going to say, no, that didn't work, and try to convince someone otherwise of what helps them. But that goes back to the critique of that term universal, that we have to take into account the individual, their motivation, their lived experience, as opposed to categorizing everybody into these different perspectives. So I think it's been just such a fascinating journey. And I shared this slide in the previous webinar as well that we did about our work with this book. And I just love that UNICEF commissioned a study about what works in helping adolescents. And these are their four key messages that are copied right out of the abstract of the study. Connectedness is the cornerstone of healthy development. Government programs focusing on reducing adolescent problems, that's like my B typo, are mostly ineffective. Evidence suggests that successful programs aim to strengthen connectedness with parents, schools, peers, moving the chat box, and community. Further programs should view young people as resources rather than problems. And that goes into one of the things Nevin brought into the book, being an outward bound researcher as well, that Kurt Hahn, one of the key thinkers of outward bound ideas, said that youth are crew and not just passengers. And I think that is sort of one of the things that we've really come back to, is that how do we set up youth so they can be courageous and curious and and feel that they're capable of going out to adventure in the world. And with that, that's sort of what we had today. Nevin, is there any closing thoughts on that you'd like before we take questions or
Not specifically, no.
anything? All right. Well, I will stop sharing. If anyone does have a question, feel free to use the chat box or unmute yourself if you'd like, or nitpick something we said that was silly. And it'd be awesome to hear from anyone. Otherwise, we can also stop the recording if people would feel more comfortable with that as well. But I'll leave it on for a second. That second seems to have now passed. Anyway, okay, Nevin tells me to can the recording so we can have a candid conversation. Okay, I will do that. Thank you everyone for coming to this, and I hope those watching the recording also enjoy the conversation.